Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I propose that we start with this session. My name is Dusan Drabik, and despite of what my t-shirt says, I'm affiliated with Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and I have the privilege of chairing this session. Unfortunately, it's only two of us here because the third presenter was not able to make it now. I think she presented earlier. I would like to give the floor to Tévécia, who is going to be talking or comparing methodologies to quantify value added in the bioeconomy. Tévécia.
Thank you. So, okay, thank you. So, as introduced by Dusan, I'm Tévécia Ronzon, and I will present a study that has been made from the work of many co-authors belonging to different research institutes across Europe, namely the Wageningen University in the Netherlands, the Dusan Institute in Germany, the Finnish Research Institute for Economics in Finland, the European Commission, well, this is a joint research center based in Seville, the Nova Institute in Germany, and CITA, the Agri-Food Research and Technology Center from Spain. Most of the authors and research institutes also collaborate in the BioMonitor project. My presentation will be on the measurement of the value-added size of the European bioeconomy, because as already repeated many times in this conference, we celebrate a decade of a EU bioeconomy strategy, and in 2012, when the bioeconomy strategy was launched, we missed data, we missed information to be able to monitor what was going on the bioeconomy and possibly to retarget or adjust the strategy and the action plan. One thing that I can say is that the research community answered very well this need, because after 10 years, there are many different proposals for quantifying the value added of the bioeconomy coming from those different European research institutes that I mentioned before. So it's really good news, but then I have the feeling personally that all those efforts are not optimally used by the policy making process. And I see two reasons for that. First, because it's not easy to understand why the numbers that are quantified in the literature are different, because it's because of different methodologies, and it's not the job of policymakers to enter into those scientific details. And this was the subject of a conference I made last year at the ICABR. And second, because of the very numbers that are different, and those divergences may appear very confusing at first time. So this year, my purpose is to explain a bit more why those differences, what is measured, and how they can be, in fact, used by policymakers beyond the first divergence. I will start, because it is essential for understanding the second part, by wrapping up quickly the four families of methodologies that we have seen in the literature. I will not enter into equations, and because this was the purpose of last year, but you need to have an idea a bit of what is measured in each case. So there are four families of methodologies: the output-based approach, the input-based approach, a weighted input-output-based approach, and the upstream and downstream approach. The output-based approach, as its name says, looks at the outputs produced by the bio-based industry. And it will quantify the value added of those industry proportionally to the biomass content of the products that are produced by this industry. And in the case of services sectors, because there is no biomass content in intangible services, then the value added will be quantified proportionally to a so-called bioeconomy relevance. So we can say that this family of approach, by looking at the bio-based products on the market and bio-based services, is more quantifying a market vision, let's say, the value added generated by bio-based markets. Then the input-based approach, instead of looking at the output of bio-based industry, is looking at inputs, the use of biomass, which is completely different, and we will see it in numbers after. So it is based on input-output tables where the value added of a given industry is proportional to the biomass input cost share, meaning the cost of biomass inputs over total inputs. The weighted input-output based approach has been proposed by Finnish researchers in order to provide policymakers with a middle ground quantification to avoid policymakers to want to question so much the different numbers. And in fact, they use weighted coefficients from the two former methodologies. And finally, the upstream and downstream approach calculates two effects, let's say. A downstream effect, which is exactly the same as what is quantified in input-based approach, how much value added is linked to the use of biomass in bio-based industry, and the upstream effect, which is looking at the proportion of the output of an industry that is used by the core bio-based industry like agriculture, forestry, fishing, manufacture of food, paper, and wood products. So this would be the value added that is generated for the bioeconomy to happen because they use input from those industries. And this fourth category of approach, compared to the former ones that had a market vision or a biomass use vision, they are looking more at the integration of bio-based activities into the whole economy, both upstream and downstream. So this is for the wrap up. Now, why did I say it might be confusing to find numbers coming from those different approaches? Because you can see that you can find one quantification and even the double if you look at the total size of the bioeconomy. Of course, because all four approaches measures different things, in fact. And my purpose now will be to explain the different elements that are quantified by those four methodologies and what policy questions they can answer to. So if we start with the output-based approach, in this case, the value added that belong to the bioeconomy and is generated by primary sectors is estimated to 200 billion euros, meaning that the primary sector is 78% bio-based. Well, in the output-based approach, all the output coming from agriculture, forestry, and fishing is considered belonging to the bioeconomy, while the rest of the primary sector, meaning mining activities, are not considered bio-based at all because the output has no biomass content. So in this family of approach, the quantification of a bioeconomy value added from the primary sector is in fact the value added of biomass production. That's easy. Now, if we turn to the secondary sector, the quantification for the whole EU bioeconomy would be around 550 billion euros with a bio-based share of 20%. In this case, as I said before, it gives an information of the value added size of bio-based markets, how much industries generate as value added by selling bio-based outputs. And the evolution or even the quantification of this bio-based share gives an indication of the potential for development. I'm not saying that it is possible to reach 100% bio-based share, but if we are at the level of 20%, for sure we can see that there's still room for development. Then, concerning the tertiary sector, this is a very tricky sector for the output-based approach. As you can see, there are minimum and maximum estimation that represent the uncertainty behind calculation, with a minimum being 700 billion euros and a maximum 1,900 billion euros. In this case, I think this approach gives elements to policymaker if we go a bit more at a more disaggregated level. It will quantify, for the case of downstream activities of the manufacturing and primary sector, the value added generated by those activities that trade, transport, distribute, repair the bio-based products. So how much the production of biomass and bio-based products and bioenergy generates as value added downstream the value chain. In the case of sectors like tourism, this methodology will provide a number for paid recreational ecosystem services that are considered representing natural tourism, which is part of the bioeconomy in Europe. And this number, you can't find it anywhere else for the whole Europe and for all member states of Europe. For tertiary activities like knowledge production, research, development, and innovation, well, this methodology will look at the bioeconomy relevance, meaning the value added that is generated by knowledge production in bioeconomy relevant fields like life sciences, biotechnologies, bioengineering, etc. And this is again an element that is of importance for policymakers. Now, if we compare with the input-based approach, well, very first message, numbers are smaller and largely smaller. The size of the primary sector is comparable, again, to 200 billion euros. In this case, the input-based approach also considers that biomass producing activities are totally belonging to the bioeconomy, but they add a bit of value added coming from the mining industry, because mining activities use biomass products, for example, for the bioleaching. So this is the additional value added that's coming from this method, and that informs, in fact, on the dependence of the mining sector from renewable biological resources, which is something that we never talk about, but which is in fact pregnant in other countries like South Africa, where mining is really part of the bioeconomy strategy. If we turn now to the secondary sector, it is a bit smaller, quantified through the input-based approach, 300 billion euros compared to 500 billion euros in the output-based approach. The difference here is that we only calculate the value added that is generated by the use of biomass for the production of bio-based products and bioenergy. And the monitoring of the evolution of this bio-based share also informs on progress made towards the substitution objective. The higher this share, the more bio-based industries have replaced fossil resources by renewable biological one, which is also an information that our policymakers are looking for. And an observation, the biomass input cost, the bio-based share in this case, is lower than the biomass content in general for the secondary sector. Now, the tertiary sector, for the input-based approach, it's the calculation is very systematic, so it has the merits to give a precise number and not this uncertain minimum maximum range. It's much lower calculated from a biomass use point of view than from a bioeconomy relevance. And it answers questions like how far biomass derived products have penetrated the rest of the economy, meaning how much value added is generated in bioeconomy services by using biomass and bio-based products that were produced from the former sectors. I will not comment on the weighted input-output approach because anyway, it will be a middle quantification. I will then jump directly to the fourth category of approaches, the upstream and downstream. As I said, the downstream effect is almost the same as what is quantified from the input-based approach. So I will just comment on what additional information we can get from the upstream, the quantification of this upstream effect from that method. So in this case, yeah, sorry, it might be a bit confusing because what is written with letter is what's coming from only the upstream effect, and what is in number, in fact, is the total calculation of upstream and downstream effect. I should not have put that on the slide. But I can just say that, again, the quantification of the value added generated by the primary sector is in the same order of magnitude that for the other three sectors. So this is not where we really have problems in understanding numbers. But the quantification of the upstream effect is also a very valuable information for policymakers in the sense that it gives an idea of how far primary sector is depending from the use of fossil-based resources. the higher the upstream effect, the more core bioeconomy sectors are using fossil resources. As regard for the secondary sector, the upstream effect here show how much value added does the manufacturing sector generates from sourcing the core bioeconomy sector. So how much value added is created, for example, from manufacturing machinery that is then used by agriculture or manufacturing activities. And if we turn to the tertiary sector, well, this is the same logic. How much value added is generated by the tertiary sector for sourcing the core bioeconomy. And if we apply it to a concrete example, this will give, if we apply it to research and innovation, for example, it gives a quantification of how much value added is generated by producing knowledge that is used by core bioeconomy sectors, which is important in the case of Europe because the bioeconomy strategy derives from research and innovation strategies. So it remains a very important element to know how research and innovation is making possible the bioeconomy to happen. So this is to wrap up. Numbers are very different, but they also reflect different aspects of the bioeconomy. In one case, the markets, in the second case, the dependence towards the use of biomass, and then the integration in the upstream and downstream approach of those bio-based value chains into the economy. Nevertheless, there is a consensus that comes from those divergent numbers, which is that the bioeconomy services are in fact at least as large in terms of value added size as biomass producing and biomass and manufacturing activities, which came as a surprise for us because in Europe, bioeconomy strategy mainly focus on the primary and secondary sector. But now we are more conscious that by developing those sectors, in fact, there are also indirect effects along the value chain through tertiary sectors. So the bioeconomy strategy are supporting more activities than what we thought before. And I will finish with those takeaway message. So there are indeed different perspectives quantified, but this allows for answering multiple questions and even providing unexpected findings. We can say that if we look back at the moment where we had no data at all, science has provided the tools for quantifying the data that we needed, but still guidance is needed for policymakers to understand what science is producing and making good use of it. And with this, I will thank you. And I have this disclaimer that all what I presented are my opinion, and in any circumstance, I stated official position from the European Commission. Thank you.
Now it's my turn. Although I don't work for the European Commission, I would like to also state that whatever I'm going to present should not be related to the official opinions of the European Commission. I'm saying this because this project or the work I'm going to present has been supported financially by a project of the European Commission. This afternoon, I want to be talking about a conceptual framework that is a work in progress. So also the presentation will be rather short, but a conceptual framework how to look at and analyze pre-harvest and post-harvest losses. And why this topic? I think the general agreement would be that food waste and loss of food waste especially is a big problem in at the consumer level in developed countries, right? But when we look at developing countries, most of the losses occur at the production and pre-production stage, and that's what we want to analyze with my, of course, co-author Harry de Gorter. And this is a part of a bigger project we are working on, we have our model of basically of the supply chain at a commodity level, but we would like to specifically focus now on this module, which models production and pre-production stage. So that's basically the motivation. Just a few words about why do we actually observe food loss and waste. And this is, I think, something which has been already explained here by earlier speakers here, but I think that's important, especially in light of the initiatives of the European Commission. It's important to realize that rational producers and consumers, agents in general, basically will always generate some food waste or food loss, because simply the cost of producing too little is much higher than of producing too much, or the cost of not having enough, when you need to consume, is much higher than having just enough. So basically there are rational reasons for this, and this applies to any agent in the supply chain. Factors that play a role are, of course, income and opportunity cost of time. But there are also market failures like imperfect information, credit constraints, economies of coordination along the supply chain, right? So these are all factors which give rise to food waste and loss. So it's going to stay with us, and it's very unlikely that it's going to go to zero, as the European Commission proposes that should happen in the European Union by 2050. I think that's what they explicitly say. It should be reduced almost to zero by 2050, by 50% by 2020, and by almost 100% by 2050. But that's probably not going to happen unless some really radical changes are introduced to the system. Now, that said, what is then the motivation for reducing food waste? Well, there are a couple of facts. I think the first number here comes from the FAO. So basically, anywhere around 1/3 of food waste is wasted, which is basically 1/4 of calories. So that's a lot of weight right there. Of course, there are moral issues related to food loss and with food loss and waste. Population, the global population is growing, and projections by 2050 are such that basically the global population will rise significantly. And of course, there is resource degradation associated with food loss and waste, water, land, but also greenhouse gas emissions, right? So, so allegedly there could be a double dividend of reusing food waste. We would reduce hunger and save resources, and of course improve the environment. Of course, this needs to be empirically verified. Now, I already talked about the model we have actually, and it's up and running, but we are constantly improving it. This is just to illustrate what the model contains. So basically, we have all the most important stages of the supply chain, starting from producer through processors, retail, food services, and ending with consumer. Consumer can either make meals at home, or the consumers can eat away from home. And today I want to be talking about this stage and possibly before it. So I use this slide because I gave this talk 2 weeks ago at a different audience, so I apologize for this, but it is just to illustrate basically the basic economics of post-harvest loss at farm level, right? So if this is the, let's call it the original supply of a farmer, okay, as of PF, and there's a demand for the product, but this is pre-loss, okay, pre-loss. But basically what happens is farmer produces, and then basically there are losses. So the effective supply curve would be the dashed one. And then the market equilibrium would be where the demand intersects this new curve. Basically 1 minus alpha is alpha here would be the percentage of loss, maybe 10%, maybe 20%, depends on a country, right? So if alpha is 10%, then you have 90% times the original supply, basically, right? And so there would be the market price that the consumer would pay, PU. This would be the quantity sold, okay? But how much would the farmer produce initially would be, we would find that point, this QF, this point is where basically the area, this area, so there has to be some price, PF, which we don't observe, okay? But it has to be such that this area, which is basically the revenue to the farmer, if he had no waste, okay, has to be equal to the revenue taking into account the waste. Okay, so very basic principle. So this is with post-harvest, but that's not a objective of, or that's not the primary objective of my talk today. What I want to be talking about are pre-harvest losses. Now, I gave a shorter version of this 2 weeks ago in a meeting, online meeting with the European Commission. And when I started talking about pre-harvest losses, they were very surprised. And that's why I also said that what I say here is not what the Commission thinks, because they don't analyze pre-harvest losses. They don't have them on their repertoire, on their radar yet. Okay, they only focus on post-harvest and basically food waste. But I say, why not have the model ready to be able to analyze this? Anyway, so what's causing pre-harvest losses? Well, first of all, there are many uncertainties, right? During the cultivation stage, like pests, diseases, weeds, and so on and so forth. There might be bad weather, for example, low prices, okay, so that occur before the harvest. So this would be all examples of reasons. Then common outcomes of these uncertainties are unharvested acres. Simply when the prices are too low, farmers might decide not to harvest cabbage or whatever they have, okay? So that would be, they would not even harvest it, or yield goes down as a result of pests and so on and so forth. And here are also some examples of quality losses which also occur, might occur, fungi, for example, and all kinds of stress conditions and so on and so forth. So these are the things which ideally our model should be able to capture to some extent. So how do we do this? We assume a representative farmer who basically operates under uncertainty, right? Because the farmer at the moment he plants, he doesn't know what the final outcome will be. So there's uncertainty related to this. And we assume, for simplicity, 2 stages of the world: good weather and bad weather, okay? Of course, this uncertainty is related to weather. It could well also be related to prices, but for simplicity, we only look at the weather at this moment. And so it's our farmer is the expected utility maximizer. These are Bernoulli utilities, and phi would be the probability of the good weather state occurring, and one minus that would be the probability of bad weather occurring. Now, sorry about this jungle, notational jungle. I can assure you this was not the reason why the Commission was worried, okay? Because I didn't present the equation to them. But I'll try to walk you through this. So essentially here what I have is the profit in the good weather state, okay? So what happens is we assume that price which the farmer gets is certain. And basically, we start with something we call Y. Y is the some optimal potential output. I'm sorry, it's potential output. Okay, so it's something you could get under ideal conditions. Now, Y will be our choice variable. What can Y represent? Y can be, for example, well, Y is yield, right? But Y is yield, but yield is the potential yield, and it represents, for example, the cultivar of a plant. We in this conference we've been talking a lot about many technologies. Okay, so farmers essentially they can cope with uncertainty by choosing an appropriate cultivar for their wheat, for example. And g of x is a function which basically is the abatement function, which tells you that if you use a certain amount of effort, capital X, that function translates that effort into the percentage of the potential output which you can save. This function is basically inspired by Lichtenberg and Zilberman's work in 1986. And then, so essentially this would be the effective yield we would get. And then we multiply that, of course, by the harvested area, H, G is of course for the good weather state. And then post-harvest is the, related to post-harvest is the percentage of loss, post-harvest loss alpha. Okay, that's also a choice variable for the farmer post-harvest. Okay, so basically proper storing and I don't know what. Okay, so it's important to realize that there are different things going on here. So that would be the revenue, and now we come to cost. And here we distinguish several types of cost to be able to model different interventions or different options that a farmer has to minimize pre-harvest and harvest losses. So first, there is CF would be the cost of the cost related to the planting of the crop. Now notice that here I don't multiply this yield by A, but only by A, because A is independent. A is the area planted, not harvested, is the area planted, because the farmer at the moment of planting doesn't know how much he or she will harvest, right? And so then I have X1 and X2, and I think I didn't explain them here, but these are the efforts which a farmer can take into account when working on, when minimizing pre-harvest losses. So why don't I go to this slide? Basically here, I have these efforts, X1 and X2. For example, I can be, basically these X1 and X2, they relate to the elements of pre-harvest losses I presented before, right? But when the farmer, of course, can use several of them. I just use two here, and they can have, there can be some substitution effects between them, right? So that's why we aggregate them into capital X, which is this aggregated effort through some CES aggregator. Now, so let me come back here. So that would be the cost of that. And then this here is important for participants to this conference, because this is the cost related to improving the yield, the potential yield, right? So think about this. There might be Y is my yield, but if I want to get higher yield, right? It's the higher yield I get, it's costlier and costlier, right? So that's reflected by this function. And K is just to represent that over time, this cost might go down, you know, due to technological progress and so on and so forth. Then this here is also some function which basically tells me that if I want to save, if the waste is going to be, for example, 10%, lost, post-harvest loss 10%. So in effect, if I want to achieve if I want to preserve 90% of my harvest, there's also some cost associated with it, right? So for some farmers, this cost function might be pretty flat. For some, it might be steeper, but we want to understand what is the effect of the curvature of this cost on the total outcome. And then, of course, there is some cost associated with harvest. So this is to capture the fact that it might be that some farmers don't harvest everything that they planted, right? Because simply the cost might be too high. And so that's represented by this. And then this last term is basically the cost of disposing of the losses. In many cases, this will be zero, might be zero, but in some other cases, there might be positive cost associated to that. And so the farmer would take that into account. Now, basically the structure for the bad weather scenario of this problem is almost identical. And so then what happens, I'm coming to the end of my presentation, is these are the choice variables of the farmer, okay, several. First of all, the farmer basically chooses optimal level of post-harvest loss in good weather and bad weather, optimal amount of harvested land in good weather, bad weather. Y is only one, because this is the choice that the farmer has to make pre-harvest, right? So it's basically independent of the state of the nature, and also the amount of efforts are independent of this. So what we try to do with this model is to of course, we will do some comparative statics here to understand the effect of individual parameters. And why this might be important. Well, let me get back to here. Now, in this conference, we said how important the technology is, right? So this technology would basically affect yield, okay? So essentially, we would be affecting this cost, okay? And let's assume that over time, the technology becomes less expensive, okay? So there will be some downward trend over time. So essentially then, this would be the shock to the system. As cost goes down, it might be that the farmer might afford to waste more, right? It might be, but waste more and produces more because Y would probably go up. What I want to say is that it is possible under certain circumstances that the waste, the loss in this case, would increase, right? But then this begs a question: what does that imply for the claims of reducing food loss and waste in the first place? Okay, so this concept of pushing on reducing food loss and waste, it is what I want to say is it's not clear that we should really aim for reducing food loss and waste. Okay, I guess that's what I want to say, because this might be a natural result of some other factors in the system. Okay, so that was my presentation. Sorry for the confusion if there was any, but I'm certainly happy to take questions and answer them. Thank you.